Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to ACN's first webinar for the 2014-15 year. We are going to wait a couple of minutes because there's just about 6 of you on the line, and then we're going to start in just a few seconds. So I hope that everyone can hear me. If you can't hear me, I'm just going to do a quick sound check before we start. But I'm just confirming that, in fact, this is being broadcast. So hold on just 1 second. Great. So I think we should start. There's about 9 of you online right now. The way these webinars work is that we're going to run through a presentation. I'm hopefully not going to take more than 20 to 30 minutes on presenting the information in the presentation. And then towards the end, we're going to deal with questions. If you can, and if you are familiar with the webinars already, then this is a repeat, but you should be able to type your questions in on the panel to your right, and I will be able to then read them off the screen and then address them in community as well. So do keep note of your questions and make sure that you track them so that I can respond to them towards the end. You can even start writing questions as and when they come up, but they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. So welcome again. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for taking the time to participate in this webinar. We're very excited to be able to give you a sense of what the job search is like. As many of you may know, last year was the first year that a whole group of you, and from the ACN community especially, graduated from university for the first time. Prompting us to start looking for job opportunities and placing many of you in careers on the continent and elsewhere. So much of this webinar will contain information on our experience with that process, and we will give you some lessons learned, but also importantly guidelines that you can take forward with you, as many of you are thinking of the job search this next year. So let me start by sort of talking to you about the purpose of this webinar to start with. Many of you are currently looking for a job. Those that are on this call are seniors for the most part. And we understand that it's an incredibly anxiety-provoking and stressful time. And we know that from our experience last year working with your peers that this can be incredibly stressful. So what we wanted to first of all reassure you is that this is incredibly normal and you're not alone. But that the point of this webinar is to try and give you some strategies and tools and techniques that will help alleviate some of this stress. So just so you know, the job search can often unearth the best and worst of emotions. So the key on that is to not let others get to you and to always ask for help. The reason that Africa Careers Network is here is to partner with you on your job search. So we're going to offer you guidelines and tools to see how you can best leverage this partnership to the best of your needs. So I'm going to give you an overview of what this webinar is going to be about. There's several components to what we're going to discuss. The first is a broad overview of what the job search looks like. Now, we're aware that many of you may be well into the job search while others are just beginning. So just so we can cater to as wide a possible an audience, this presentation will be very basic and it will provide you with time to ask for questions. So do be patient as we get through the content of this webinar because there is something for you and there's probably something relevant for you during the course of this webinar. Second, this is a group session and we won't be able to respond to unique questions unless they are actually applicable to the broader audience. So if you have specific queries that you think will be applicable to a group of people, send them across. But if not, please address your ACN coordinator or MasterCard Foundation program, Scholars Program coordinator such that you can have a specific follow-up conversation with that person. So to start off with, and finally, just one last point is that the advice that is provided here will be a guideline. This is not to be taken verbatim. This is supposed to be customized to your unique needs, so use your common sense as well. So let's start off with the first section that is outlined before you. We're going to talk through 3 phases of the job search: planning, executing, and closing. And I'll go through each of these phases in detail to just describe what they contain and what these different phases entail. We're going to spend a little bit more time on what planning for your job search looks like, which is going to be the second bucket of things we'll be discussing. We'll touch on a high level on what executing your job search is about. We won't talk about closing, not in this session, but you can expect some subsequent webinars that will deal specifically on closing, etc., closer to the time when you're actually going to be closing your job search. And I can talk to you a little bit about what that will entail at this point. We'll talk at a very high level about non-job opportunities and also next steps from this webinar, and then obviously time for questions towards the end. So let's start with the first piece, which is around the 3 phases of the job search. As you can see, hopefully in front of you, there's 3 segments of the job search that we've identified based on our work with a lot of your peers this past year. This first section that we'll talk about in detail is around planning, and that exercise should be started to be undertaken around 6 to 10 months before you graduate, so right about now, for many of you that are graduating from North American universities, and some of you may have already started this process well in advance. What does this look like? A lot of this process is introspection, so it's around personal assessments of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, etc. I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. And also some research in general on options, so you can generate a list of options for yourself on what you would like to do after you graduate. Just some advice on this piece. We believe that this section is roughly 70% driven by you, and 30%, between 30 and 40%, we can help you as Africa Careers Network, either your ACN coordinator or your MasterCard Foundation program scholar coordinator as well can help you through this process, in addition to your career counselors on campus. So, but importantly, you are the driver of this agenda, so it's important that you understand sort of the work split on that. The second piece of the job search is around executing the job search. Now, this we believe is roughly between 3 and 6 months before you graduate, so planning can take up to a couple of months even, and some of you have started that already, which is fantastic. The executing of the job search is, here's where your partnership with either your ACN coordinator, your career counselor, or your MCF program coordinator as well is vital, because this is where he or she will be able to introduce you to organizations, to mentors, etc., and help you follow up with those connections. And this is where the third bullet comes in. Follow-up to all of these introductions is key, and some guidelines around that are being persistent and being professional. And we'll talk a little bit about that at a high level, but we'll have probably a follow-up webinar to this webinar that deals specifically around executing and acing that segment of the job search. And finally, the third segment of the job search that we've identified is critical for you to understand and plan ahead for is closing the job search. Now, this can't be taken lightly and is quite important for you to get right as well. This typically is just before you graduate and can comprise a variety of different activities, including getting your verbal or written offer, managing logistics such as transport, work permits, etc., before you actually start and working on your job full-time. Much of this assumes that you will be looking for a job. However, as I mentioned earlier on, we'll be also addressing at a high level non-job opportunities, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that towards the end and possibly have some follow-up webinars dealing with that specific issue. So let's start at the very beginning in terms of the planning. So as I mentioned, planning is very much of an introspection and is largely driven by yourself as the candidate for the job search. This can be often a very critical and difficult piece to undertake because it involves asking a lot of questions. So I've outlined a few questions here, around 5 buckets of questions, if you will, to help aid your job search. Some of you may have all of this figured out, many of you may not, and that's entirely fine because I think the whole point of a job search is to try to get to some answers that will help guide your job search. The first set of questions that you will start asking yourself is, what am I interested in? to understand your value. Almost put a SWOT analysis together for yourself to be able to understand what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, etc. This can be very tricky, or it can be very straightforward. And what we suggest is working very closely with your campus career counselor, as well as your ACN coordinator, and anyone you really feel is a good mentor for you to help you walk through some of these questions, especially if they're a little bit more murky than for some others. The second set of questions that you need to be asking yourself is, where do I see myself in 10 years, in 5 years, in 2 years, for you to map out your career goals. Now this is actually, it sounds very straightforward, but it can also be quite tricky. Some of you may think you have a specific job title in mind, or some of you may have a specific sector in mind, but rather ask the hard questions of what do you see yourself doing in about 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, and really work backwards so that you're able to answer the questions. So you see yourself running a company in 10 years rather than I'd like to be CEO of an organization. So rather move away from titles to actually describing what it is you will be doing, and try and be as specific as possible in terms of the sector that you'll be interested in, the skills that you'll be working with, the area that, or geographic area that you will be working in, etc., to try and give yourself some clarity as to where this job search is headed. And the reason we like for you to think backwards is that many of your immediate next steps will be informed by the bigger plan. And even if your bigger plan changes, which it should, and many of us, many years down the line, still keep changing our big plans, it's important for us to just have a bigger plan to help anchor some bigger decisions that you will be forced to make in the next few years. So the bottom line is, this isn't something that is gospel, but it's an important set of questions to guide immediate decisions that you'll be making. So you've answered the first two questions. Now the third set of questions that's really important to consider are skills and experiences that you need to get to where you want to be. So suppose you said, I want to run my own NGO in X social sector, etc. What do I need to do before I get to my 2-year plan? So it could be as basic as get more grassroots experience or get analytical capability. So many of you, for example, are interested in the consulting sector. So what do you really need to get to where you want to be? So it could be building your problem-solving skill set or your math skills. So this is actually quite difficult to do in a vacuum. You may want to talk to people to understand, okay, this is where I see myself in 5 years, in 10 years. What are the skills that are really important to actually get to where I need to be? You will probably find that you'll need to actually leverage quite a bit on your career counselor for this kind of information. So you may not know what kind of skills and experiences are needed to actually eventually do what you want, which is perfectly normal and fine. So this is part of the conversations you need to have with your career counselor on campus, as well as your ACN coordinator or whoever you feel most comfortable with. So once you've identified the skills and experiences that you need, the fourth area where you need to sort of think through a lot of personal introspective questions is assessing your situation. Very critically, what are the constraints you are facing? And be very honest with yourself on this, because you could have student loans, you could have family obligations, and many of us are in this situation where we know that some of these obligations exist and we can't wish them away, so it's important to actually take stock of this. And importantly, personal preferences and considerations. There could be relationships to maintain, geographic preferences, etc., lifestyle choices that are really critical to be clear about, so that can help guide your decisions when it comes to both listing organizations, postgraduate opportunities, as well as locations where you'd like to work. This can be also very difficult to address with other people. So if this is something you'd like to keep private, that is also absolutely fine. But in your own personal introspection and journey, it's important to just take stock of the situation to make sure you're making the right decisions for the right reasons. And the last bucket in terms of questions you should be asking yourself in the planning phase is around researching and pursuing opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more in more detail about this. But given those the answers to the first 4 questions, What ideally are the organizations or the settings that are most conducive for me to get the experience I need, given all of what has been said above? So this could range from I've articulated my long-term career goals. I think a big multinational is actually the best place for me to start with because of the branding opportunity and the networks. Or it's a small startup because I actually need to know how to run my firm and understand how to raise capital and work in different sectors at the same time. Or you might be faced with a unique set of circumstances where your technical skills are really important, especially, for example, in the health sector, and we'll talk a little bit about sector-specific things a little bit later on. So graduate school might actually be the right next step for you. So given all of what you've described in the first 4 sets of questions, this set of questions should effectively inform you to help develop a list of places where you think the right opportunities and settings would exist for you to get skills and experience. The whole process you should start as early as possible so that you allow for plenty of time and allow for changing your mind, because the whole point is this is not a science and this can change and this can be a very anxiety-provoking process. But again, I'd like to stress that it's driven by you, so you need to be the owner of this agenda. So moving on to generating your list of options. So here we have some suggestions here. As I said, to follow on the last bullet from the previous slide, it's important that you research your organizations given your personal choices and preferences. What we recommend is drawing up a list of actual names of places, and we're going to stick to jobs in this section and talk about graduate school, etc. At a later point. But we recommend highly that you list no fewer than 5 and no greater than 10 opportunities. The reason for this is that ideally you should think through your plans A, B, and C, such that your sure bets, you're not only sort of sinking all of your eggs in one basket, unless you have a job, a great relationship already and a likely job offer with a company, which is separate. But importantly, it's important to cap the number of organizations you are interested in applying to around 10, just to make sure that you give each of these organizations their due time and attention. So if you're actually applying for more than 10 companies, it can often be that you're not actually giving each of them the time and attention that they deserve, and they might end up falling through the cracks. You can make mistakes like listing the wrong names on the CVs. You can get tired. You won't necessarily have enough time to prepare and do custom prep for each of these. So this is again a guideline, and you could always go further up or lower than this, obviously, but it's something we recommend based on what we've seen in our experience last year. How do you generate your list? This is an important step because I think many of you have ideas as to where you want to work. For example, I'm very interested in renewable energy, but you may not know what the big players in renewable energy are, whether it's on the continent or in the US or elsewhere in the world. So this is where you need to leverage your networks. You can use your ACN coordinator, your campus career counselor, or your MCF Scholar program manager to help generate options. Another important source of information is the ACN portal. So, for example, all of last year's opportunities for internships as well as jobs are still posted for you to be able to browse through the different sites to say, this looks like an interesting opportunity, and it looks like there's an established relationship with ACN already, so this is something I'd like to consider. So this is very important for you to draw up a list of possible places to work. Also use your informal networks like your peers, so people who have worked in other places in the past or who you know are working elsewhere, to come up with a list for you to work with. And I think the more you talk to people, the more it can help you to generate the list and also whittle it down. Then the important thing for you to know is researching deadlines and timelines, so understanding when organizations in your industry typically hire. I could talk a little bit about some specific industries, for example, consulting, and especially strategy consulting and in investment banking, aggressively hire in the first term of the academic calendar, which is now. So we're going to be posting adverts quite soon on the ACN website for some of the relationships that we do have. But typically, many of these companies come to your campus and start recruiting immediately for for full-time opportunities in 2015. Many companies on the continent, however, do not recruit so far in advance for next year. So that can be a bit of a downside, and this is where you can again use your ACN coordinator to help you manage those relationships. So be mindful as to when organizations typically hire and what the lead and lag times are for different applications. And like I mentioned earlier, it's important to access your network and use mentors as and when they are available. I will be talking a little bit about how to use mentors in the executing piece just after this. The final piece of advice that we'd like to give you, especially in the planning phase, is that the basics have to be in place. So this is a non-negotiable, and if this isn't done, it's actually going to significantly jeopardize your job search. What do we mean by the basics? Having a short bio, some of you have already updated this information on your ACN portal, but it's critical for you to list key accomplishments, most recent internships, and critical skills, as well as your university and your graduation date. So this is information that should be handy. The reason for this is that this is the bio that will be circulated to recruiters who will not have time to necessarily peruse your CV or attachments, etc., but will make potential spot judgments on your short bio. So this has to be updated, and this has to be up to scratch. And we are happy to work with you to give you templates to work with, as well as help sharpen what you have on file. The second obvious one is having an up-to-date CV, and here we encourage you to use templates that we have provided and will continue to provide over the next few months. Please run it past your career center as well as your peers, because this is a critical source. You think you probably have thought, you've covered everything in your CV, but you probably would miss the typo that someone else can pick up. So it's critical for you to get feedback on this, and importantly to use the templates that we do provide as well. The third item on this list is very basic and quite straightforward, but cannot be taken for granted as well, is a signature. The reason a signature is really important is that oftentimes emails will be forwarded around internally between recruiters in an organization, and they will often wonder, how do I reach this person? And if an attachment is missing, or if that information is not handily available, you could miss a phone call or an email or a follow-up. So always having your updated signature with contact information, and if possible, even access to your time zone or just some reference to location, because many employers on the continent may not know what time zone you're in and could set up a call for 9 a.m. not thinking you are on the east coast of the United States. So as much as possible, without cluttering your signature, it's important for you to keep that up to date so that you can be readily contacted. And the final thing is a LinkedIn profile. Many employers actually have started asking for a LinkedIn profile in advance of your job search, or just randomly go to LinkedIn and look at your profile. You do not want to be caught with a poorly updated profile or with a profile that's inappropriate, because this could inform whether or not they actually invite you to an interview. So we believe that these are the four sort of basic things that are important to keep in place, and obviously we'll get to the subsequent phases of cover letters, interview, etc. But having this in place guarantees you at least the first step or foot in the door in many instances. I'm going to touch on a high level as to what executing the job search is about, and as I mentioned, this is the second phase in the job search process. And we'll go into more detail at a later stage during this season. But this phase really is for you to get, now that you've developed your list of organizations, this is where the ACN coordinators, for example, will be incredibly valuable. They can make targeted introductions to organizations or to mentors, depending on what your question is. And this is where Africa Careers Network has cultivated valuable relationships to employers, both on the continent and off, that are vital to the job search. A big lesson learned from last year's experience is that relationships are critical to the job search. You may send in your CV to an online site, but you may not receive any sort of response whatsoever, but you could flag this with your ACN coordinator, for example, and they send it into the same organization and you have a completely different response. So we urge you to take advantage of this relationship. So make this list available to your ACN coordinator or MCF Scholar Program coordinator, such that they can ensure that you are introduced to the right contacts and that they can follow up. So what does this entail? This includes you sending an email, etc., with your bio, CV, and cover letter, applying to a link on ACN, and we'll make all of this information available to you in more detail further down the line. The second big segment of executing the job search well is preparing and customizing your prep for that particular organization. So understanding the rules of email etiquette. So once you have been introduced to an organization or a mentor, how do you follow up? Do you CC everyone? Do you make sure that everyone knows when there's no response, etc.? And again, I'll refer to the third bucket here, which is around persistence and professionalism. These are the two P's that we think are critical to your success in this phase: being persistent, but also being professional. You do not want to become a thorn in someone's side to the point that they do not want to give you a job. But on the flip side, you do need to follow up, even though things could fall through the cracks. So email etiquette is a big one here, and I think importantly, use your coordinator, your career counselor, etc., to run drafts of emails past them. Make sure that you're addressing people appropriately, etc., so they can give you important feedback as to how to follow up on a specific introduction. Many a time you will find that people say, very exciting to be introduced to someone, but there's no real follow-up. So I think it's important for you to suggest follow-up and to also have actionable recommendations in terms of following up a specific email introduction. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail at a later stage as well. Obviously, preparing for interviews and in some cases case interviews is critical, and you can't do this early enough. So once you've established your list of organizations that you're working with, research these organizations. You should have done that already, but know them well. And you don't necessarily have to recite the website or the mission and vision verbatim, but know them well enough that you are strategically thinking about them, such that when you are called for an interview or have an informal conversation, you have a very informed position. For example, if you're interested in a career in private equity on the continent, you're not necessarily caught off guard not being able to name the top 5 private equity firms in Africa. Or for example, if you're interested in renewable energy, understanding the most critical innovations in the renewable energy space or the big players, etc. So it's important that your prep for an interview is quite detailed. And again, we'll do some additional webinars to follow up in detail about how you can ace this. The third section around this is on mentorship, and I just wanted to touch very briefly on what mentorship can look like. It can be a very valuable tool, but it can also go terribly awry. When we, for example, have introduced several of you to mentors, there's been limited follow-up on both sides. There's lack of clarity as to what the mentorship conversation is about. Again, use your coordinators, your career counselors, and your scholars, your MCF Scholar Program coordinator to understand what is it that I'm trying to get out of this conversation. For example, if you are interested in the healthcare space, be very specific in terms of what your question is to the person, to the professional you're being connected to. Should I pursue graduate school? Should I work in Africa versus in another place? Should I look at programs in Europe versus the US? And just have some specific questions that you can raise rather than keeping it too open-ended. Otherwise, most professionals who are incredibly busy will not be able to help you, and they will also get frustrated if they don't hear a very coherent set of questions that you'd like to address. So this is at a very high level on the executing of the job search piece, and I'm going to move on because we'll have subsequent webinars that address this in more detail. Finally, on non-job opportunities, I'd like to just mention very briefly that we know that many of you are considering graduate school. We know that some of you are considering fellowships and postgraduate scholarships, etc., and also considering entrepreneurial ventures. We won't be able to spend a great deal of time addressing those here, We hope to continue posting these opportunities on our Facebook page, so that's why I provided the link. Talk to your ACN coordinator, your scholars program coordinator, etc., and your career counselor to make sure that you're aware of what these opportunities are about. And we hope to host specific webinars on each of these, or at least all of these, in the subsequent months, because these are critical decisions that you may need to make as well in the months ahead. Immediate next steps I think that you could consider following are setting up time for your main point person, whether that's a coordinator at ACN, your career counselor on campus, or your scholar program manager, to walk through the planning section and work out some of the answers to the questions, but importantly, developing a list and communicating that list to the point people that I've mentioned. Identifying the organizations and options post-graduation. Like I mentioned, we've given you a rough timeline, so the next month or so should be dedicated towards that planning phase. And then we will also inform you of the upcoming webinars in the next few months. We'll have a mid-season check-in on execution and follow-up, and we probably would have a host of learning circles on specific sectors such as consulting, finance, and health. And if not, we will send you links to existing webinars on the subjects as well. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions because I've spoken enough, but would love to, very briefly, just wanted to flash in front of you who the different point people are. So I am director of ACN, and Gaki Imungi is the manager for East Africa. She runs all of the opportunities for Africa Careers Network for East Africa. Theo Sutherland is the manager for West Africa, and Robin Sweetman currently manages Southern and North Africa. And as many of you know, Ansi Harford manages the Scholars Program within ACN, so many of you will be liaising directly with her. And we also have Vivian, who's our analyst on ACN, who will also be handling some small opportunities. So this is the team, just in case you do not know us already. But I'm happy to provide this information to you as well electronically so you can know how to reach us. So without further ado, I'm going to start with questions. Hopefully you have some. And so far we have one question. Okay.
All right, so we have one question so far, which is there an option for us to review our ALA contract with regard to geographical preferences for jobs?
Great. This is focused much more on the job search and not necessarily ALA-centric, so I'm going to reserve quite a general comment on that. But yes, for those of you that are ALA students, you can definitely talk about where you will be working after you graduate from university and actually make that information known. For those of you that are on that contract, we can talk definitely about deferment options, and those are available and quite easy to access. So I suggest that you actually liaise with your ACN coordinator specifically to follow up on that kind of question. Any other questions?
This is Theodore on the phone. A question I've gotten over the last couple of weeks was, can we talk to people in ACN who are not our point people?
What does that mean? Like
Can we talk to Bobby only instead of talking to
Yes, absolutely. I think that the most important thing is for you to talk to whoever you feel comfortable with, because we're not restricted. We have organized ourselves by region, as I mentioned, primarily to help us facilitate relationships with employers in that region. However, there is Ansi, who is the Scholars Program Coordinator. There are your career counselors. There could be informal mentors, etc., within your network that you feel more approachable, that are more approachable to you. Absolutely speak to whoever you think you can connect with. That's the most important first step. However, you have to be mindful that some relationships will be managed by different people, so ultimately someone else might come into the picture anyway. So if it's important for you to speak to someone else in the beginning and the outset to help figure your questions out, absolutely consider speaking to other people.
All right, we have two more questions. First one, Given that some of the deadlines have already come up for consulting companies, should we still wait for them to come up on ACN or apply directly?
This is a great question. Definitely flag, and we are aware that your campuses may start recruiting for consulting, etc. already, which is absolutely fine. Please make your ACN coordinators and other team members aware of your application so that we can flag them on the Africa circuit. The reason we ask you to do that is oftentimes it's important for us to know that you have applied to these organizations and we can flag it to our recruiter. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important. We have these relationships and they know us and they trust us and they are willing to consider you with extra scrutiny in addition to the original process. It's not to say that this is a different process, but this is an additional set of eyes that are willing to look at your application. So please flag that if you have not already.
Great. And then the next question is, you mentioned that there will be health and finance webinars in the next few weeks. Could we also have a tech webinar for those of us majoring in computer science?
That's a terrific idea, and we will probably be able to organize something. What we also would like to do is to have you and your peers help organize a webinar, because some of it is about giving advice, but some of it is about just asking questions and having a platform. So we can make a platform available to you. So if you can we can suggest topics to you that you can then run. We will try and get you experts, but at the end of the day, I think it's also important for you to also take the leadership in running some of these. So I think what would be best is if you could send us some suggestions as to webinars, and we can suggest a process and a framework to making them happen. But absolutely, I think a tech webinar would probably be easy to organize, and there's several of your peers that are doing some interesting work in that space.
On that note, I would also like to add that there are quite a number of people within the network who have gone through processes around finding jobs or starting entrepreneurial ventures, and so you can probably connect with them on LinkedIn. The ALA Graduates Group has been revived to allow for people to meet in subgroups, so you can connect with each other and learn from each other. So there's not enough time necessarily for all the niche interests to be dealt with on webinars, but there are platforms available that you can use to learn more about your interests and collaborate with other people.
All right, next question. If you have received an offer but would like to continue searching for other opportunities, what is the appropriate way to inform the offering company without completely rejecting the offer?
This is a great question, but a critical response to this is, a critical piece of the response is that you will need to know the deadline of how long your offer is valid for. Some companies that give offers this far in advance often have exploding deadlines, which means that the deadline expires within a month or 2 months. You may be able to negotiate that, and it depends on the relationship that you have with your employer or your former employer to see if you can talk about exploring other opportunities. And again, this is again about your personal relationship, so you could choose to be as candid or not. However, this is where I would love if you could work closely with your ACN coordinator, if they've helped you with the previous opportunity especially, to help craft an appropriate response to say you are thrilled about the offer, you would like to understand what the deadline for response is, you are potentially considering exploring some other opportunities, but you'll have to get back to them, and you want to know when you have to get back to them by. It's acceptable in many cases to want to explore, but we wouldn't suggest that you push it too past the deadline, because most companies have to make human capital planning requirements much ahead of time, so they have to actually make these decisions well in advance. So my suggestion is be very professional, get a lot of help in terms of how you actually craft the response, and very, very importantly, understand what the deadline for response is on that offer.
Is there mobility in terms of working in different African countries if you do not have work authorization at this time? This is pertinent where an opportunity might not be available in one's home country.
This is another terrific question, and we're considering actually having probably a webinar on this particular issue in the next few months. We strongly recommend that you look for opportunities within your home country or in places where you have valid work authorization. This could mean, for example, that you're Moroccan and you can work in Senegal, etc. But there's some restrictions around that as well. We've come afoul of some opportunities last year where students found opportunities and we've helped them look for opportunities in South Africa, but immigration restrictions have actually tightened quite significantly, making it difficult for them to relocate. These are circumstances beyond anyone's control. So we would strongly encourage you to first pursue your home country. However, we are very mindful that there's big economies on the continent, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, that are attractive, especially for some industries. Again, talk to your ACN coordinator, talk to your career counselor, understand your big picture path. In some instances, it may make sense for you to work in Dubai or the US before you come to your home country, especially if your home country is quite small in the economy in the sector that you're working in. I'm not necessarily encouraging that, but it's not out of the question. But I think the point is you need to have a conversation, you need to understand what the sector is, what the economy is like, and importantly what the work permit restrictions are about before you make a decision one way or the other so that we can help guide you to have a smoother process.
Okay. For students studying in the US, is it appropriate, who are taking a semester off, is it all right for them to apply with the normal job cycle, or should they, and ask for that offer to be delayed, or should they apply with the next cohort of students?
It depends on, so the question is around delaying or applying with different cohorts, and we are mindful that different people graduate at different times. And for example, people in the Southern African calendar graduate in December. It depends on what you're applying to and which industry, for example. So many corporate and industry jobs in South Africa or Southern Africa are on the Southern African calendar, which may require you to apply with either the previous cohort or the next cohort if it throws you off. However, I think at the end of the day, it depends on the organization in question, as well as how far off you'll be. So if you're able to secure a job offer and defer for 6 months, it's probably preferable. It gives you peace of mind. But some companies are just not willing to hire that far in advance. So this is a fairly specific question, so we'd need to know what sector you're looking at, what organizations you're looking at, what is your geography, and when you're graduating. So this is something I'd encourage you to take up with your coordinator. But also, if we can develop some guidelines around this, we'll share them with you as well.
How can we get connected to alums or consultants to practice consulting cases?
This is a great question. We will try our best to give you a list of those that are working currently as consultants, as analysts for the first time this year. There's several of your peers that are currently working as consultants or have just started their careers or have just been through the interview process. So we have a list of those, and many of them have indicated that they're available. So if you can, again, ping your ACN coordinator with names and contacts, we're happy to share them with you. Just a point around that, we would love for you to tier your practice sessions such that your first few practice sessions around case prep are with your peers, and your subsequent practice sessions are with junior consultants in the field and those that have had a couple years experience, rather than kind of expending all your capital on senior consultants in the first round. The reason being is that you need to get better and better at it and also give yourself incrementally bigger challenges to help prepare for some of these interviews. And again, we have a list of people who are available to help case prep that are also some slightly senior. So we're happy to share both tier 1 students that you can prepare with who've just entered the consulting profession, as well as those that are slightly more experienced. There's a question, hold on 1 second. I don't see any other questions. If your question has not been answered, can you type it or raise it now, please?
So we have a question. How much time do you recommend spending on the job search?
I'll refer you to the first part of this session where we talk a little bit about the different elements of planning. So as I mentioned, planning, executing, and closing. Planning should be between 6 to 10 months before you graduate. Reserve time for the executing piece because it is 3 to 6 months before you graduate. All of you are doing other things, so it's not as though you have a lot of time on your hands and you have a lot of external pressure as well. So if you can loosely follow these guidelines, it probably is appropriate, but also be mindful you need to plan for worst case. So things could go wrong. You may be required to spend a lot more time on something else that's school related, etc. So plan ahead, plan buffers to each of these. So we've given you a guideline as to how to plan the year, but also plan for big deviations from this plan as well, so that you need to be mindful of creating buffers around this. So these are conservative estimates, but you can talk to us about specific issues that you have in mind as well.
For clarity, the question is how many hours a week would you recommend putting aside, plus or minus?
I would almost consider it as your fifth class if you're taking 4 classes a semester. So this is something that you would dedicate time almost daily, if not at least a good several hours a week. So this should be your fifth class in the 4-class paradigm. So it's important for you to carve out the time to actually plan for this, such that you are devoting the appropriate time for this. You may find that you're doing a lot of this work on nights and weekends, but many other professionals may not be working that schedule. So you have to be mindful that people respond during office hours, etc. So this is a full-time occupation, especially in the planning phase. But I think as you get into the different phases, you'll find that this becomes more routine and that you're just following up. But consider it as your fifth class and devote the time accordingly. I don't think we have any further questions for the moment, but I'm assuming that this is the start of hopefully many discussions on this, which you will then continue with your ACN coordinators, your NCF program scholar coordinator, and your career counselor on campus. So we look forward to working with you through the year. We will record this and send it to your peers, but if you do have follow-up questions, please send them to us. And also give us suggestions on what kind of webinars you'd like to see in the future. Thank you very much for attending, and we will be in touch very soon. Have a great rest of your day. That's what
Wow.